Vanessa shot up in her black dress, voice cutting through the church like a knife. "You're not my family anymore. Stop embarrassing me." Gasps filled the room. Robert Miller, 69, stood frozen beside his son's coffin as his grandson clung to him, only to be pushed away by Vanessa's hand. In a heartbeat, the grieving father was turned into a public joke. But what no one knew, if you believe betrayal never goes unpunished, hit that subscribe button and tell me where you're watching from. You have no idea how outrageous my daughter-in-law truly was. The silence in the church was sacred, heavy, almost suffocating. The organ's final note lingered in the air like a prayer for the dead. Then, out of nowhere, Vanessa rose tall, rigid, her fitted black dress hugging her frame, her expensive glasses reflecting the dim light of the sanctuary. She leaned into the microphone, her voice jagged, venom dripping from every syllable. "You're not my family anymore. Stop embarrassing me." The words didn't just cut, they detonated. Gasps burst from every pew. Faces twisted in disbelief. Heads snapped toward the old man standing by the coffin. Robert Miller, 69, widower, retired cop, and grieving father, froze in place. His hands shook, but not from age, from the cruelty of being cast out on the very day he buried his only son. His grandson, Ethan, too young to understand the depth of the wound, screamed in fear and clung desperately to Robert's leg. For a flicker of a second, Robert thought love could anchor them together until Vanessa yanked the boy back, shoving his tiny arms away. The gesture wasn't subtle. It was a slap to Robert's soul. The room grew colder, tighter, suffocating with judgment. Right there, in the presence of God and man, Robert was transformed from father and grandfather into a spectacle, the butt of whispers, the target of pitying stares, the unwanted one. His chest burned as if Vanessa's words had branded him for life. And yet, behind the humiliation, something darker stirred. For Robert knew truths none of them did. He knew what he had given up, what he had built, what still carried his name. They thought they had erased him. But the ink of sacrifice never fades. And in that moment of disgrace, Robert stopped being a grieving father and became something else entirely. Before the venom, before the humiliation, there had been trust. Robert Miller, 69, had once believed Vanessa to be the daughter he never had. When Daniel first brought her home, Robert welcomed her with open arms. He cooked her favorite meals, fixed the leaky sink in their starter apartment, even slipped money into Daniel's hand when he thought she wasn't looking. To Robert, family wasn't about blood, it was about sacrifice. After his wife died too young, Robert poured every ounce of love he had left into his son. Daniel was his pride, his anchor. So when Daniel and Vanessa announced plans to start their life together, Robert gave without hesitation. He sold the family's ancestral home, the one his father had built with his own calloused hands. The creak of those wooden floors carried generations of memories, but Robert signed it away in a heartbeat. The money became the seed that sprouted Daniel's law office, the foundation of the success Vanessa flaunted like it was her own achievement. His pension, carefully saved for the twilight of his years, was drained to cover their first mortgage. Robert even put his name on the deed, ensuring Daniel and Vanessa had a place to build their dreams. He told himself it was worth it, worth the sleepless nights, worth the ache in his bones, worth living smaller so they could live larger. To Daniel, he was a father. To Ethan, he would become a second parent. But to Vanessa, all those sacrifices blurred into nothing. She smiled then, of course polite, gracious, the mask of a grateful daughter-in-law. Robert never guessed how thin that mask was, or how quickly it would crumble once she no longer needed him. He thought loyalty was permanent. He thought family meant forever. But as he stood in that church, shamed and cast aside, Robert began to understand. To Vanessa, family had always been conditional. The cracks began small, almost invisible. Vanessa would roll her eyes when Robert told old police stories, or sigh loudly when he dropped by unannounced. At first, Robert brushed it off. Maybe she was stressed. Maybe law office life was wearing her thin. He told himself it was nothing, every family had rough edges. But as Daniel's career soared, Vanessa's patience with Robert shrank. At dinners, she shifted her chair away when he sat beside her. At gatherings, she laughed a little too loudly at his outdated jokes, making sure everyone noticed. She started introducing him as Daniel's dad, instead of dad, a subtle demotion that sliced deeper than she knew. The shift grew sharper when Vanessa began surrounding herself with wealthy friends and powerful business partners. Suddenly, Robert's presence felt like an inconvenience she wanted hidden away. She'd mention how old-fashioned he was, how he didn't understand their lifestyle. And Daniel, caught between the two people he loved most, stayed silent, never correcting her. Robert swallowed the bitterness, convincing himself it wasn't worth making a scene. He still had Ethan, the boy who ran into his arms with unfiltered joy every time Grandpa walked through the door. That love was enough to quiet the sting, at least for a while. But Robert could feel it, the distance growing. Every smile from Vanessa seemed rehearsed, every word dipped in condescension, and in the back of his mind, a question whispered louder each day. Was I still family, or just a guest in my own son's home? It didn't happen all at once. It was death by 1,000 cuts. At first, Vanessa's barbs were disguised as jokes. "Don't worry, Robert, we've got the bill, you just enjoy your retirement," she'd say, loud enough for the entire restaurant to hear. People chuckled, but Robert felt the sting. He had been the one who bankrolled their beginnings. Yet here he was, painted as a dependent old man. At neighborhood gatherings, Vanessa made subtle digs about how Robert still wore the same jacket from years ago, or how he didn't get their conversations about investments and luxury trips. Each remark was met with polite laughter, but Robert could see the sidelong glances, the quiet smirks. His dignity was slowly being chipped away. Daniel never called her out. He simply sat stiff, eyes down, as if silence could shield him from the discomfort. To Robert, his son's quiet felt like betrayal wrapped in fear, fear of confronting the woman who had grown too comfortable, disrespecting the man who gave them everything. Then came the ultimatum. Days before the funeral, Vanessa's words cut deeper than any knife. "You don't have to come, Robert. We'll handle it. People don't need to see you like this. Like this." As if he were a burden, an eyesore. As if the father who had carried Daniel through every storm had no right to stand at his son's farewell. Robert said nothing. But inside, something cracked. For the first time in his life, he realized silence was no longer protecting the family, it was destroying him. The church air was thick with whispers after Vanessa's outburst, but Robert only heard the pounding of his own heart. Ethan, sobbing, clung to his leg like a lifeline. For a moment, Robert thought the bond of blood would shield him, that love would silence the cruelty. But Vanessa's hand tore Ethan away, her glare cold, final. The child cried harder, reaching back, and Robert's world collapsed. He stood motionless, his face pale, his grief hijacked by humiliation. Guests shifted uncomfortably in their seats, some pitying, others whispering, no one stepping forward. Robert felt their eyes burning into him, judging him, erasing him. In that instant, he realized he wasn't just burying Daniel, he was burying the illusion of family. A lifetime of sacrifice flashed before him, the home he sold, the pension he drained, the sleepless nights he drove across states just to keep food on their table. Every act of love had led to this being branded a nuisance at his son's funeral. Robert's throat tightened, but no tears came. Instead, something colder settled in his chest. A vow unspoken but unbreakable. If they wanted him erased, he would show them just how impossible that was. He lowered his gaze to Ethan, whose small hands still reached toward him from Vanessa's grip. Robert inhaled slowly, his jaw clenched, his spine straightened. This wasn't the end. It was the beginning of something else entirely. Before the shame, before the venom, there were years of sacrifice no one cared to remember. Robert Miller had not always been the frail old man Vanessa dismissed at the funeral. Once, he was a young officer, badge on his chest, strength in his stride, carrying the weight of the world on his shoulders while raising a boy alone. When cancer stole his wife far too early, Robert did not crumble. He cooked breakfasts, packed school lunches, learned how to braid Daniel's hair before picture day. He worked double shifts at the precinct and still showed up for every Little League game. Every scraped knee, every report card, every nightmare in the dark, Robert was there, steady as a rock. He never let Daniel see him break. Money was always tight. Other officers bought new cars or took vacations. Robert patched uniforms and drove the same worn sedan until the doors groaned. But he told himself it didn't matter. Daniel's future was worth more than his comfort. Each overtime hour was another brick in the foundation of the life his son would one day build. And when Daniel made it into law school, Robert cried for the first time in years. Not out of weakness, but out of relief that every sleepless night, every penny saved, had not been in vain. He thought the hardest part was behind them. He thought his devotion had secured a bond no one could break. But standing in that church decades later, he wondered, had he been too soft? Or did he simply want so badly to be loved, he ignored the signs that love was not returned? The house stood for generations, a modest two-story with peeling white paint, the smell of oak beams and old memories woven into its walls. Robert's father had built it after returning from war, brick by brick, board by board. Robert had grown up there, learned to ride his bike on its cracked driveway, kissed his wife on its porch, carried Daniel through its doorway as a newborn. That house was more than wood and nails. It was history. It was love. And yet, when Daniel came to him with wide eyes and plans for a law practice, Robert didn't hesitate. He signed the papers, sold the house, and handed over every cent. Watching the keys change hands felt like watching a piece of his soul being pried away. Still, he smiled for Daniel's sake. He told himself he was passing down more than money. He was passing down hope, opportunity, a future brighter than his own. The night after the sale, Robert sat alone on the empty porch steps, listening to the echo of silence where laughter used to be. He let the tears come then, quietly, because no one was around to see. To the world, he was the strong, retired cop, the steady provider. But to himself, he was just a man stripped of the last physical tie to his parents, to his wife, to the life he had known. And Daniel? He was too busy celebrating with Vanessa to notice the hollow look in his father's eyes. Robert didn't mind, or at least he told himself he didn't. Sacrifice was what fathers did. That night, as he turned the key in the lock of his smaller, rented place, he whispered a vow. As long as my boy succeeds, nothing else matters. But years later, standing shamed in that church, Robert felt the sting of irony. Nothing else mattered until it did. Robert should have been slowing down by then. Most men his age were fishing on weekends, fixing up old cars, or resting their tired backs. But not him. Near 60, he was hauling freight cross-country in a rattling truck, miles of asphalt blurring into sleepless nights. His knuckles stiffened around the wheel, his eyes burned from fatigue, but he pushed on. Every mile meant another bill paid, another safety net for Daniel's family. He remembered the calls from Vanessa when Ethan was just a baby. We need extra for the hospital stay. The insurance didn't cover this procedure. The office needs a new copier. Each request came wrapped in urgency, and Robert answered them all the same way, by climbing back into that truck, by swallowing another pill for his aching joints, by trading his twilight years for their comfort. Sometimes, parked at a gas station at 3 a.m, Robert would glance at the family photo taped to the dashboard. Daniel in his suit, Vanessa smiling wide, Ethan cradled in her arms. Robert's chest swelled with pride, even through the exhaustion. This is why, he told himself. This is worth it. But the truth whispered louder on those endless highways. Every dollar earned was another piece of his life slipping away. He missed birthdays, anniversaries, moments he could never get back. And still, he told himself, love demanded sacrifice. Standing years later in that church, humiliated by the very woman whose hospital bills he had paid, Robert wondered if those miles had ever meant anything to her at all. In his garage sat a relic of his past, a weathered patrol car, the very one Robert had driven during his years on the force. To him, it wasn't just metal and wheels. It was memory. It carried the smell of leather mixed with sweat and coffee, the echo of radio calls that once defined his life. That car had been there the night he pulled Daniel out of a snowstorm, the night he rushed home to his wife's side before she passed. It was more than a vehicle, it was the last thread connecting him to the man he once was. When Vanessa went into labor with Ethan, the medical bills piled high. Insurance faltered, costs ballooned, and panic filled Daniel's voice when he called his father. Robert didn't hesitate. The next morning, he polished the chrome one last time, drove the car to a collector, and sold it. The money covered the delivery, the hospital stay, and Vanessa's care. Ethan came into the world healthy, and Robert told himself it was worth it. At the hospital, Vanessa had tears in her eyes when she thanked him. She held Ethan close and promised, "We'll never forget this." Robert believed her. He carried that moment in his chest like a badge of honor, proof that sacrifice bound families together. But years later, her words rang hollow. At the funeral, when she shoved Ethan away from his arms, Robert felt the cruel weight of that lie. She had forgotten every promise, every sacrifice erased with one public act of contempt. And all he could think was, "I gave up my past for you, and you discarded me like nothing." It wasn't always shouting or insults. Sometimes the cruelty came in silence, in the way Vanessa's smile stiffened when Robert entered the room, in the way conversations conveniently shifted the moment he tried to join. She had a talent for making him invisible. At dinners, she placed his chair at the far end of the table, away from the center of laughter. At parties, she introduced him as Daniel's dad, instead of the grandfather Ethan adored. The sting came sharper when Robert overheard her whisper once, sharp as a blade, "He's just old, always hanging around. It's exhausting." She didn't know he was standing only a few feet away. He froze, his chest tight, but he said nothing. Pride and pain waged war in silence. Daniel noticed Robert could see it in his son's eyes. But Daniel never intervened. Maybe he was tired, maybe he feared confrontation. Either way, the result was the same. Robert was left to absorb the blows alone. The hardest part wasn't Vanessa's disdain. It was the quiet complicity of others. Neighbors stopped inviting him over. Friends of Daniel stopped greeting him warmly. He became the shadow trailing behind his own family, tolerated but never embraced. Robert told himself he could endure it, that Ethan's hugs were enough to drown out the sting. But each ignored word, each averted glance, carved deeper into his heart. And as those silences piled up, he began to wonder if he had given his whole life just to be treated like a ghost. Amid the shadows of contempt, one light never dimmed, Ethan. The boy's love was pure, unfiltered, untarnished by Vanessa's poison. Each time Robert walked through the door, Ethan sprinted toward him, arms wide, shouting, "Grandpa!" as if the world itself had been waiting for that moment. Robert would lift him high into the air, his aching back forgotten, his heart full again. They built forts out of couch cushions, shared late-night ice cream, and whispered secrets under the stars in the backyard. Robert taught Ethan how to fish, how to tie a proper knot, how to ride a bike without fear. And in those small moments, Robert felt alive, as if his sacrifices had found their purpose. But Vanessa's disapproval hovered like a storm cloud. She often interrupted their laughter with a sharp, "It's bedtime," or "Don't spoil him." Her eyes carried irritation, as though Robert's presence diluted her authority. Yet no command could erase the bond between grandfather and grandson. Ethan's hugs were fierce, desperate even, as if he sensed the fragility of their time together. That day at the funeral, when Ethan clung to Robert's leg, sobbing, it wasn't just a child's grief. It was a plea to hold on to the only constant love he knew. And when Vanessa yanked him away, Robert felt not only his own heart break, but Ethan's too. For the first time, Robert realized his grandson needed protecting just as much as he did. Ethan's love was the last rope keeping Robert from drowning, and it was also the rope Vanessa tried to sever. In the sleepless nights that followed, Robert replayed every memory, every sacrifice, like a reel stuck on loop. The house he sold, the car he gave up, the years he traded on the road, all for a family that now treated him as a burden. The humiliation at the funeral wasn't just a moment. It was the cruel verdict on a lifetime of devotion. Sitting in his small apartment, Robert asked himself questions that stabbed deeper than any insult. Was I too soft? Did I give too much, hoping it would buy me love? Was I blind to the truth that respect cannot be forced, that gratitude cannot be begged? He had spent his life giving, believing that one day the love would circle back. Instead, it left him hollow, standing alone beside a coffin. The image of Ethan reaching for him haunted his mind. That tiny hand, pulled away by Vanessa's grip, burned into his memory. It was proof that innocence still saw him for who he was, proof that not all love had rotted. Yet even that love was at risk of being stripped away if Vanessa had her way. Robert stared at the old photo of Daniel, smiling in his graduation gown, pride glowing in his young eyes. "Did I fail you, son?" he whispered. The room answered only with silence. And in that silence, something inside him shifted. No more illusions, no more excuses. Love had blinded him long enough. For the first time in his life, Robert admitted the unthinkable. He had been betrayed not just by Vanessa, but by his own need to be needed. And if he wanted justice for himself, for Ethan, for Daniel's memory, he would have to carve it out with his own hands. It began with a box, plain, dust-covered, buried deep in the back of Robert's closet. Inside were folders, contracts, deeds, and insurance policies Daniel had entrusted him with years ago. Robert had almost forgotten they existed. But the sting of humiliation at the funeral sent him searching, needing proof that he wasn't the powerless outcast Vanessa wanted the world to believe. One by one, he spread the papers across his small kitchen table. His tired eyes scanned the words, the signatures, the fine print he had once signed without hesitation. And then it hit him. He wasn't erased. He wasn't powerless. He was still woven into the very fabric of Daniel's legacy. The deed to Daniel and Vanessa's apartment, Robert's name was on it. The savings account Daniel had opened to secure Ethan's future, Robert was listed as joint trustee, the life insurance policy Daniel signed before his stroke. Robert was the legal guardian and executor of Ethan's trust. Vanessa could sneer, shout, and shove him aside in public, but on paper, in the eyes of the law, Robert was the one holding the keys. Every sacrifice he had made wasn't just a memory. It was inked into contracts that couldn't be undone. Robert sat back, a slow, cold calm filling his chest. For the first time since the funeral, he didn't feel weak. He didn't feel erased. He felt steady. Because the truth was simple, undeniable. Vanessa had tried to bury him, but the documents in his hands proved she had been standing on ground that was never hers to claim. Among the papers, one document stood out like a beacon: Daniel's life insurance policy. Robert traced his finger over the familiar signature, remembering the day Daniel had asked him to be there when he signed it. "Just in case, Dad," Daniel had said, with a nervous laugh. Robert never imagined how soon just in case would come. The clause was clear. The benefits were to be placed in a trust for Ethan, and Robert Miller was named the legal guardian and trustee. Every withdrawal, every use of those funds, required Robert's signature. Vanessa had no authority, no legal right to touch the money without him. Robert's lips pressed into a thin line. So all those times Vanessa had boasted about her financial security, all the times she flaunted shopping bags and new jewelry, she was living under the illusion of control. In truth, she had been spending what she could skim, but the core, the true safety net, remained under Robert's lock and key. He leaned back in his chair, the weight of revelation settling in. For so long, Vanessa had made him feel small, unnecessary, disposable. Yet here, in black and white, Daniel had written a different truth. Robert was the safeguard. Robert was the wall between Ethan's future and Vanessa's greed. The humiliation at the funeral still burned, but it began to take on a new shape. It was no longer just pain, it was fuel. Because while Vanessa thought she had cut him out completely, the insurance clause proved otherwise. On paper, in law, and in blood, Robert was still the man who mattered most. Robert's next step was quiet observation. With the documents fresh in mind, he began to watch Vanessa more closely. It wasn't hard, her lifestyle was loud. New handbags glittered on her arm, designer shoes clicked against marble floors, and luxury cars seemed to rotate in her driveway like trophies on display. Each outing, each photo she posted online, screamed indulgence. Robert started digging. Bank statements, credit card activity Daniel had once given him access in case of emergencies. Now, those records painted a damning picture. Spa treatments, international trips, parties with champagne bills that cost more than Robert's monthly pension. Vanessa wasn't just spending, she was bleeding Daniel's legacy dry. And yet, the accounts tied to Ethan's trust remained untouched, locked behind Robert's authority. Vanessa had been living off scraps, spinning illusions of wealth, while the real foundation remained far out of her reach. Robert realized her arrogance wasn't just cruelty, it was desperation. Dressed up in couture. He thought back to her sneer at the funeral, the way she shoved Ethan away as though Robert was beneath her. But the truth was clearer than ever. Without him, she had nothing. She was standing on a stage built by his sacrifice, parading in borrowed light. Robert folded the statements neatly, placing them atop the insurance papers. Every item, every charge, was another nail in the coffin of her pretense. And for the first time, Robert allowed himself a thin, humorless smile. Because now he knew the very greed Vanessa flaunted would become the rope that dragged her down. It was a friend from the precinct who sent it to him, shaky phone footage recorded at the funeral. Robert hadn't asked for it, but the moment it arrived, he couldn't look away. On the screen, Vanessa rose in her black dress, venom on her tongue. "You're not my family anymore. Stop embarrassing me." The camera panned to him, standing frozen beside Daniel's coffin, Ethan clinging desperately to his leg before being shoved aside. Robert's stomach clenched, shame washing over him all over again. But as he replayed the clip, shame gave way to clarity. The evidence wasn't just humiliating, it was irrefutable proof of who Vanessa really was. No one could spin it, no one could soften it. Her cruelty was on display for the world to see. He saved the file carefully, backing it up in 3 different places. Then he watched it again, this time with a colder eye. He studied the faces in the background, the shocked guests, the whispers, the pity. What had felt like his private humiliation had, in truth, been witnessed by dozens. The video captured more than betrayal. It captured the turning point. In Robert's hands, the clip wasn't just a wound, it was a weapon. Legal documents proved his power in silence, But this footage could do something more. It could strip away Vanessa's mask, exposing her to the very people she worked so hard to impress. For years, Robert had endured insults with bowed head and clenched jaw, but now he held the truth on paper and on film, and the combination was lethal. Not long after the funeral, Robert began to hear the whispers. A neighbor avoided eye contact at the grocery store. A distant cousin sent a vague message of concern, but nothing more. The silence was telling people had seen, people had judged, but no one dared to speak aloud what they had witnessed. Vanessa still floated in her circle of wealth and parties, pretending nothing had happened, but Robert could feel the shift beneath the surface. Then came the calls from Daniel's former colleagues, at first polite check-ins, then pauses heavy with unspoken words. Finally, one of them admitted what the others tiptoed around. She's difficult, always demanding. People are starting to pull away. Robert listened, quiet as stone. He didn't need to defend himself, didn't need to argue. Vanessa's mask was slipping on its own. The video had started circulating in private chats. He could tell by the way conversations grew awkward whenever her name was mentioned. The same faces that once looked at Robert with pity now looked at Vanessa with suspicion. For years, Robert had been the invisible man, tolerated but never embraced. Now, silence was Vanessa's curse. Invitations stopped arriving. Her so-called friends had other plans. Business partners began canceling meetings. It wasn't dramatic, not yet, but it was steady, inevitable, like rot spreading through wood. Robert sat back and watched, his hands steady, his breathing calm. He didn't need to shout. He didn't need revenge in the shadows. Vanessa's own arrogance was pushing her a lie. The final clarity came in a leather-bound folder, handed across a polished oak desk. Robert's lawyer, a man who had known Daniel personally, flipped through the documents with a calm precision. "Robert," he said at last, adjusting his glasses, "it's all here. You're not just a trustee, you're the legal guardian of Ethan's inheritance. Every account, every property, every insurance payout is under your authority until he comes of age." Robert let the words sink in. He had suspected it when he reviewed the paperwork at home, but hearing it confirmed by a professional felt different. It was no longer just ink on a page, it was power, undeniable and absolute, sanctioned by law. Vanessa had no legal standing to challenge him. Every signature, every clause Daniel had left behind was airtight. "She can't touch a cent without your approval," the lawyer continued. "And if she tries, it's fraud. You hold the line between her and Ethan's future. Thanks for watching." It was not reason to Tanya. Robert nodded slowly, his jaw tight. For years he had been painted as weak, dismissed as an old man clinging to relevance. Yet here was the truth. He was the pillar Daniel trusted, the safeguard Ethan needed, the one person Vanessa could never erase. Walking out of that office, Robert didn't feel vengeful. He felt steady. The humiliation at the funeral still burned, but now it carried a different weight. It wasn't just pain anymore, it was proof. Proof that while Vanessa had tried to bury him under shame, Daniel had left him standing guard over everything that mattered, and Robert intended to guard it with iron hands. That night, Robert sat at his kitchen table, the documents neatly stacked in front of him. The hum of the refrigerator was the only sound in the room. He stared at the papers, at his own name repeated again and again across deeds, trusts, and contracts. For the first time since the funeral, his hands did not shake. He poured himself a glass of water, lifted it slowly, and drank as though sealing a vow. There was no anger boiling in him, no wild thirst for vengeance, just clarity, a cold, unshakable clarity. Vanessa had tried to erase him in public, to strip him of dignity in front of friends and strangers alike. But she had made one fatal mistake. She underestimated the quiet man she thought was powerless. Robert gathered the folders into his worn leather briefcase, clicking the lock shut with finality. Each document was no longer just proof of the past, it was leverage for the future. Paper and ink had become his shield, his sword, his hidden weapon, and unlike Vanessa's barbed words, these weapons struck with the weight of law. He glanced at the framed photo of Ethan on the shelf, the boy's smile beaming in frozen joy. Robert's expression hardened. This was no longer about his pride alone. It was about protecting Ethan, about honoring Daniel's trust. The humiliation he had suffered would not be the end of his story. He rose from the table, straightened his shoulders, and switched off the light. The decision had been made. Robert would not fight with raised voice or reckless rage. He would fight with silence, patience, and the iron grip of truth. And when the time came, Vanessa would learn the man she tried to erase still held the pen that could rewrite everything. Robert's first move was simple, quiet, and devastating. He walked into the bank the very next morning, briefcase in hand, papers neatly arranged. The clerk scanned the documents, her polite smile stiffening as she realized who held authority. "Yes, Mr. Miller," she said carefully. "Everything checks out. You're the trustee." Within an hour, Robert froze every account Vanessa had been using. Credit cards declined. Checking drained of her access. Savings locked tight under his control. He instructed the bank to send all future statements directly to him and his lawyer. The pen strokes were clean, the process clinical, no raised voice, no threats, just signatures that cut deeper than any blade. That afternoon, Vanessa strutted into her favorite boutique, swiping a platinum card for a dress worth more than Robert's monthly pension. Declined. Confused, she tried another. Declined. Within minutes, her phone buzzed with alerts: overdrafts, failed charges, frozen assets. The empire she flaunted cracked in real time, and Robert didn't have to lift a finger to see it fall. Sitting in his modest apartment, Robert received the confirmation emails one by one. He read them without a smile, without triumph. This wasn't revenge, not yet. This was math. For years, he had given and given until he had nothing left. Now, the balance was shifting, and Vanessa, who thought she had erased him, was about to learn the true weight of being cut off. In silence, Robert closed the laptop. The collapse had begun. Robert didn't storm into parties or shout accusations. He didn't need to. The truth was already sitting in his pocket, the video of Vanessa at the funeral. With calm precision, he sent it to a handful of people who mattered most: Daniel's colleagues, the family circle, and a few of Vanessa's wealthy friends, who had always smiled a little too wide at her table. The effect was immediate. Within hours, whispers spread like wildfire. The image of Vanessa in her black dress, venom in her voice, "You're not my family anymore, stop embarrassing me," was replayed again and again, stripped of context, laid bare in its cruelty. No caption could soften it, no excuse could erase it. Her performance of grief unraveled with every view. Robert received no replies, no acknowledgments, but he didn't need them. The silence was confirmation enough. Social media posts from Vanessa's circle grew thin. Invitations stopped appearing. Calls went unanswered. Behind closed doors, the video was doing its work, pulling the mask from her face. Meanwhile, Robert kept his hands clean. He didn't argue, didn't defend himself. He let the evidence speak, cold and sharp. While Vanessa scrambled to keep up appearances, those around her now carried a new image of her, not the glamorous widow, but the woman who humiliated her grieving father-in-law at her husband's funeral. The social stage she adored began to crumble, and Robert, from the quiet of his apartment, simply watched the cracks spread. The cracks in Vanessa's empire widened when Robert made his next move, not with force, but with quiet conversations. He reached out to Daniel's closest friends, the ones who had stood beside his son in the courtroom and celebrated victories with him. Robert didn't beg for sympathy. He simply laid out the facts, the trust, the documents, the truth about who controlled Daniel's legacy. The friends listened. Some were shocked, others nodded knowingly, as if Vanessa's arrogance had long worn thin. One by one, they began to shift. The phone calls that once rang in Vanessa's favor now rang to Robert instead. "If Ethan needs anything, we'll come to you. Daniel would have wanted you to handle this." Even in the family circle, the tide turned. Cousins who had whispered behind Robert's back now reached out quietly, ashamed of their silence at the funeral. "We saw the video," one admitted. She went too far. The shame of inaction drove them closer to him and further from her. Vanessa felt the shift. Invitations that once poured in slowed to a trickle. When she showed up at gatherings, eyes turned cold, conversations cut short. Allies she counted on suddenly had other commitments. The pedestal she had built was cracking beneath her, piece by piece. Robert didn't need to lift his voice or demand loyalty. His patience, his silence, and the truth did the work for him. The allies who once stood at Vanessa's side were now standing, slowly but surely, at his. The real blow came not in society's whispers, but in the quiet authority of law. Robert filed the necessary papers with his lawyer, presenting the trust documents and life insurance policy Daniel had signed years earlier. Within weeks, the court recognized what had always been written. Robert Miller was the legal guardian of Ethan's inheritance, and by extension, the boy's protector in all financial matters. When the official letter arrived, stamped and sealed, Robert held it for a long moment in his hands. It wasn't victory, he felt, it was duty. Vanessa could no longer touch Ethan's future without him. The school, the bank, the hospital, all of them, acknowledged Robert as the one in charge. The chain of authority bypassed Vanessa entirely, leaving her powerless where it mattered most. Vanessa discovered the truth when she tried to enroll Ethan in an elite private academy, swiping her pen across the forms with practiced arrogance. The administrator glanced at the file and shook his head politely. "I'm sorry, ma'am. We'll need Mr. Miller's signature for this." Her face burned red. She argued, demanded, threatened, but the policy was ironclad. Only Robert's name carried weight. In that moment, her illusion of control shattered. She could dress herself in silk, surround herself with wealthy friends. But when it came to Ethan, to Daniel's true legacy, she was nothing but a bystander. Robert didn't gloat. He didn't need to. He simply folded the letter, placed it carefully in his briefcase, and went about his day. Because protecting Ethan wasn't revenge. It was responsibility. And that responsibility now belonged to him alone. The unraveling was no longer subtle. It was visible in the way Vanessa's calls went unanswered, the way her once bustling home turned eerily quiet. The friends who had flocked to her dinners now dined elsewhere. The boutiques that once held doors open now eyed her with suspicion after too many declined cards. Even her own relatives, the ones she thought would stand beside her, began to retreat, not wanting to be caught in the shadow of her disgrace. She tried to mask the decline with bravado. Social media posts of designer dresses recycled from old photos, captions dripping with false confidence. But behind closed doors, the truth was merciless. Bills piled high, creditors circled, and the world she built on Daniel's success slipped through her fingers like sand. Robert watched from a distance, steady, silent. He didn't need to humiliate her further. She was doing that herself. The woman who had shoved Ethan away at a funeral now sat alone in an empty dining room, her reflection staring back at her across a table set for no one. Her downfall wasn't dramatic. It was slow, suffocating, inevitable. Isolation became her prison. Every burned bridge, every whisper she had sparked, now stood as walls closing in around her. The empire of appearances had collapsed, and Robert hadn't raised his voice once. He didn't smile at her ruin. He didn't celebrate. He simply noted the silence, the absence, the weight of justice settling into place. Vanessa had tried to make him invisible. Now she was the one no one could see. When the legal dust finally settled, Vanessa tried one last desperate move, contesting Robert's authority in court. She walked into the courtroom draped in black silk, her lawyers stacked with binders, her voice dripping with indignation. She painted herself as the grieving widow, unfairly stripped of control. Her performance was polished, every tear calculated. But Robert didn't need theatrics. He sat beside his lawyer, calm, briefcase at his feet. When the judge asked for documentation, Robert's attorney simply slid forward the stack of deeds, policies, and contracts. Every page bore Daniel's signature. Every clause pointed to Robert as trustee and guardian. The evidence was clear, undeniable, airtight. Vanessa's arguments cracked under the weight of fact. The judge's gavel came down with finality. Robert's authority was confirmed, her petition denied. The silence that followed wasn't just legal, it was personal. The courtroom, filled with people who once admired Vanessa, now saw her stripped bare. Robert didn't smirk, didn't glance her way. He gathered his papers, stood tall, and walked out without a word. Justice had been delivered, not with shouts or vengeance, but with quiet certainty. The law had spoken, and in its silence, Vanessa's downfall was complete. As Robert stepped into the sunlight outside, he felt no triumph, only resolve. The battle wasn't about winning. It was about proving that truth, carried patiently, could outlast even the loudest lies. It happened in the house that once bore Daniel's name, now reclaimed by the very man Vanessa tried to erase. Robert stood in the doorway, briefcase at his side, papers already signed and sealed. The rooms were bare, furniture repossessed, silence echoing where laughter once lived. Vanessa sat at the dining table, mascara streaked, hands trembling over an empty wine glass. "Please," she whispered when she saw him, "we can work something out. Ethan needs me." Robert's face didn't move. His eyes, once soft with years of forgiveness, were cold now, steady. He set the final notice on the table. "Ethan needs stability," he said flatly. "And you've proven you can't give it to him." Tears spilled, her voice rising with desperation. "You're taking everything from me." Robert leaned forward slightly, his voice low, precise the same tone he once used as a cop when delivering hard truths. "No, Vanessa, this isn't revenge. This is math. You overdrew your balance." Back in Tim's, she broke then, sobbing into her hands, the weight of her ruin pressing down on her at last. Robert didn't reach out, didn't comfort. He simply turned, the echo of his footsteps carrying through the hollow house as he walked away. Behind him, Vanessa's cries filled the emptiness. Ahead of him, Robert felt only resolve. The final confrontation was not a clash of fury, but the simple accounting of justice. She had tried to erase him. Instead, she had erased herself. The house was silent behind him as Robert stepped into the cool evening air. He didn't look back. Vanessa's sobs were muffled by walls, now stripped of wealth, of pretense, of everything she thought made her untouchable. For the first time in years, Robert felt no weight pressing on his chest, only release. Ethan waited in the car, his small face pressed against the window. When Robert opened the door, the boy flung himself into his grandfather's arms, clutching tight as though afraid to let go. Robert held him close, steady, and firm. "It's just us now," he whispered, and Ethan nodded against his shoulder. As they drove away, Robert didn't dwell on Vanessa's ruin. He didn't need to. Justice had already been served, not with fire or fury, but with quiet, lawful precision. The bridges were burned, the accounts closed, the silence complete. Streetlights streaked across the windshield as Robert steered them toward a future free of chains. He had given his youth, his savings, his pride, and nearly his dignity. But tonight, he reclaimed the one thing Vanessa could never touch: freedom. He didn't glance at the rearview mirror. There was nothing behind him worth seeing. The days that followed felt different, lighter, as though the weight of decades had finally slipped from Robert's shoulders. His phone no longer buzzed with demands. No letters arrived begging for bailouts. No one treated him like an afterthought. The silence that once cut him now healed him. He had made the clean break at last. Robert and Ethan settled into a modest home on the edge of town, a place with creaking floors and a backyard big enough for a boy to run free. There were no chandeliers, no polished marble counters, no illusions of grandeur, but there was peace. Each morning, Robert brewed coffee while Ethan chattered about school, his laughter filling the kitchen like sunlight. It was simple. It was enough. Sometimes Robert caught himself staring out the window, marveling at the quiet. No more walking on eggshells around Vanessa's sharp tongue. No more humiliation disguised as jokes. The ties had been cut clean, the bridge burned behind him, and he didn't regret it. For the first time in years, Robert belonged to no one's shadow. His life was his own and Ethan's. Together, they were building something Vanessa could never touch. A home forged not by wealth or appearances, but by love and resilience. The break had been painful, but it was complete, and Robert vowed he would never go back. Vanessa tried, of course. The first calls came in late at night, numbers Robert didn't recognize, but her voice spilling out when he let them go to voicemail. Pleading, bargaining, even threatening. "You can't keep Ethan from me forever," she snapped in one message. In another, her tone dripped with false sweetness. "We can fix this, Robert. Just let me explain." He deleted them all, one by one, without hesitation. He had given her years of his life, endured her contempt, swallowed her insults in silence. Those days were over. The clean break meant no contact, not now, not ever. When letters arrived, he didn't open them. When mutual acquaintances hinted she was struggling, Robert simply nodded and changed the subject. He owed her nothing, not his time, not his pity, not even his anger. His silence was the truest punishment of all. Ethan never asked about the missed calls or unopened envelopes. Perhaps the boy already understood, in the way children sometimes do, that love and cruelty cannot share the same space. When Vanessa's name slipped into conversation, Robert's only reply was steady and final: "We don't need to go back there." And with every boundary he held firm, Robert felt the chains loosen further. Vanessa could scream into the void all she wanted. He wasn't listening anymore. Freedom didn't arrive with fireworks or celebration. It came in the quiet moments, in the way Robert could sit on the porch at dusk, without tension gnawing at his chest, in the sound of Ethan's laughter unshadowed by sharp commands. The air felt different, lighter, as if every breath no longer carried the weight of someone else's disdain. For the first time in decades, Robert's schedule was his own. He no longer answered midnight calls demanding money. He no longer sat at family dinners waiting for the next insult disguised as a joke. His life wasn't measured by Vanessa's moods or Daniel's silence. It was measured in mornings spent fishing with Ethan, in evenings teaching him chess, in weekends fixing up bicycles together. Freedom also meant rediscovering himself. Robert picked up his old guitar, fingers rusty but eager. He joined a small community group for veterans, men who understood sacrifice without needing explanation. For once, his stories weren't mocked, they were valued. He didn't chase grand ambitions. He didn't need to. Freedom was enough. It was peace in the ordinary, dignity in the everyday. Vanessa had tried to strip him of both, but he had reclaimed them in silence. And as he tucked Ethan into bed one night, the boy whispered, "Grandpa, I feel safe with you." That, Robert realized, was freedom's truest gift. It was in Ethan's smile that Robert found his true reward. Not the frozen accounts, not the reclaimed deeds, not even the courtroom victory, but the simple curve of a boy's grin, unburdened and genuine. Each morning, Ethan greeted him with arms thrown wide, laughter spilling out like sunlight. "Grandpa, come play!" he'd shout, and Robert's heart softened in ways money could never buy. They planted a small garden together in the backyard, Ethan's hands muddy as he pressed seeds into the earth. "This one's yours, Grandpa," he said proudly, pointing to a row of beans. Robert chuckled, ruffling the boy's hair. It wasn't about vegetables. It was about roots, they were growing together, stronger than any that had been cut away. At night, Robert read Ethan's stories until the boy's eyelids drooped, his small hand clutching Robert's sleeve as if afraid he'd slip away. In those quiet hours, Robert felt something he hadn't in years. Purpose, a reason to rise each morning, a reason to carry on. Vanessa had tried to sever that bond, yanking Ethan from his arms at the funeral. But here they were, side by side, healing in the safety of each other's love. And every time Ethan's smile lit up the room, Robert knew this was victory. Not loud, not cruel, but pure and lasting. The kind of victory that could never be taken away. There were nights when Robert sat on the porch, the moonlight spilling across the yard, and thought about the years he had lost. The house he sold, the pension he drained, the car he gave away. Decades of sacrifice poured into a family that had turned its back on him. By all accounts, he should have been bitter. But he wasn't. He realized regret had no place in his heart. Every sacrifice had led him here to Ethan's laughter in the kitchen, to peace in his own home, to freedom from chains he once mistook for love. The cost had been high, but the return was priceless. Vanessa's betrayal still echoed sometimes, but only as a reminder of where blind devotion leads, of the dangers of mistaking obligation for respect. It no longer stung, it educated, and Robert carried that lesson without shame. He looked at Ethan, sprawled on the floor with toy cars, and knew he would do it all again if it meant protecting the boy. Sacrifice, after all, wasn't wasted when it found its way into the right hands. Robert leaned back, exhaled, and let the cool night air wash over him. No regrets, only resolve. The past was gone, the bridges burned, and he would never, ever look back. If there was one truth Robert accepted without hesitation, it was this. The bridge between him and Vanessa was gone, burned to ash at the funeral, when her words cut him deeper than any knife. "You're not my family anymore." There was no repairing that, no rebuilding what she had so eagerly destroyed. At first, some relatives urged him to reconcile. "She's still Ethan's mother," they said carefully, as though guilt could bend his resolve. Robert listened, nodded, and said nothing. But in his heart, the answer was unshakable. There would be no forgiveness, no return. That bridge wasn't just burned, it was erased from his map entirely. Vanessa lived now in the ruins of her own making. Robert didn't check on her, didn't ask, didn't wonder. She was a closed chapter, a name without weight. His only focus was Ethan, the boy who still ran to him each morning with unshaken love. And in the stillness of his evenings, Robert felt no temptation to look back. That bridge had carried too much pain, too much humiliation. He had walked across it for years, bleeding at every step. Now, with it gone, the road ahead was finally clear. Some bridges are worth saving. This one was worth burning, and Robert never doubted he had done the right thing. On a quiet Sunday morning, Robert walked to the cemetery with Ethan by his side. The boy carried a bundle of fresh flowers, his small hands gripping them with care. Together they stopped at Daniel's grave, the stone cool and gray beneath the rising sun. Robert knelt slowly, brushing leaves from the marker. For a moment, he said nothing. Then, in a voice steady but soft, he spoke. "Daniel, you can rest easy now. Ethan's safe. I'll take care of him, just like I promised." Ender. Ethan placed the flowers at the base of the stone, then leaned against his grandfather's shoulder. The boy didn't need explanations. He simply knew he was loved, and that was enough. Robert rose, his knees stiff, but his spirit lighter than it had been in years. He looked at the grave one last time, not with sorrow, but with resolve. The battles were over, the betrayals behind him, the chains broken. As he and Ethan walked away, Robert did not glance back. The cemetery faded into the distance, the road ahead clear and open. The story had ended not with forgiveness, but with freedom, and that freedom was his to keep. If this ending gave you the justice you've been craving, make sure to like, subscribe, and share your story below, because the fight for truth never ends.